the Google Pixel and the Apple iPhone. Two devices both highly rated for their camera prowess, but which one comes out on top? Welcome back to Byte Review. Let's put it to the test, shall we? Before we get started, let's do a quick run of those specs. The Pixel is rocking a 12.3 megapixel sensor, an aperture of f2 with electronic image stabilization, while the iPhone has a 12 megapixel sensor, an aperture of f1.8 and has optical image stabilization on board. For this test, both cameras have been left in auto mode with auto HDR enabled, so it's purely down to the phones and how they decide to take those photos. Let's get started with some HDR shots. After expecting results to be pretty similar, I was really surprised to see the differences in this shot. The Pixel has managed to keep the colours in the photo, whereas the iPhone has washed them over a little. In fact, the whole photo on the iPhone looks a little washed out. The Pixel has kept a load more detail in the grass and the rock face too. Exposure is pretty good on both, but overall I think the Pixel wins this one. The differences here are a lot more pronounced. On the iPhone side, we've got a much more flat looking image compared to the Pixel, which has jumped up the colours quite a lot. I actually quite like the effect. It reminds me of the Galaxy S7 a little. The sky is also totally different on each of these shots. The iPhone is actually a little closer to how it was with the whites, but the Pixel has kept the image cleaner and has more detail, so for me it still clinches the win. This one is actually harder to call than the other two. The iPhone has done a better job of the exposure, but the Pixel has kept a lot more detail in, and it's easier to make out the horizon. Looking closer at the rock, you can see the Pixel again keeps more things clear, and the ocean is also a bit more detailed. While I prefer the iPhone's exposure on this one, I actually think the Pixel has produced a better photo overall, so that's another win for the Pixel. While I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with these two photos, I prefer the exposure on the Pixel from the iPhone. The blue of the sky has been kept brighter too, while the shadows on the leaves are actually really nice and deep. The iPhone has kept the sky a little darker and the shadows in the leaves are a bit lighter in general. Detail has been kept well in both photos, so this one really is down to your personal preference, and for me I think that's just about the Pixel. Moving on to some more detailed shots now. At first of this photo, the differences are actually a little harder to spot. The Pixel has produced a slightly more saturated picture with darker shadows and the greens popping a little better than the iPhone, but if you take a closer look you can see that both have done great with detail. Overall, it's a tough one to call, but I think the Pixel edges out the iPhone for me just with those popping colours. For me, this is an easy one. The Pixel has produced a much clearer image than the iPhone in general, and that goes in terms of detail too. Zooming in, you can see the iPhone has smoothed out the rock face quite a lot, while the Pixel has managed to keep things a little bit more detailed. Zooming back out, you can see the colours on the Pixel again pop out more, and the iPhone feels like it has that strange haze again over the entire photo. It's got to be the Pixel for this one. I find this photo pretty interesting, and it's mainly because of the colour difference from the flowers towards the centre of the shot. Take a look, the Pixel seems to have picked up way more yellow from the flowers than the iPhone, almost as if it's added them in. In terms of detail, the Pixel beats out the iPhone again too, with much less softness in general. The iPhone's overall exposure feels a little dark in comparison too. Yet again, I think the Pixel pulls ahead here. So after everything I've said about the Pixel being great with punchy colours and saturation, you're probably expecting the Pixel to beat out the iPhone on colour in general. Well, it seems that's not always the case. Take a look at these following photos. The iPhone has done a much better job at separating and reproducing the colours of the chalk in the room. The Pixel has a much warmer hue to it, and the blue background is almost blended away completely. The iPhone has a lot more punch to the colour now too. Trust me, I was as surprised as you were, so I reran this test a couple times, but lo and behold, things came out on top for the iPhone. It really is an easy win here. This flower shows a lot less difference than the previous photos. Exposure on the iPhone is set quite high, which actually almost results in overexposure on the left hand side. It does make the rest of the photo a bit more appealing though, but it's not necessarily better. The Pixel has done a much better job at keeping the exposure more balanced across the entire shot, and I think this one comes down to personal preference a little. For the more balanced shot, I think I just about prefer the Pixel's rendition. More flowers now. With this photo, I can't really find much to complain about on either device. I can't find anything that's particularly wrong with either shot. Interestingly, it looks like the Pixel's missed focus on the middle of this one, however I think that's due to its focusing distance rather than it messing up any focus. Personally, I prefer the iPhone's darker exposure, but the Pixel retains more detail in those spiky parts. Tell you what, I think I'll leave this one with you guys to decide which is better. A much better exposure from the Pixel here, which has produced a much nicer image with the colours being brought out rather nicely. It's a far cry from the chalk photos we saw earlier, with the Pixel easily beating out the iPhone in this one. There's also some cheeky bokeh in both shots too, which isn't amazing by any means, but it's great to see coming from a smartphone. I think it will still be a good while until we see phones truly crack low light photos. These photos were taken in really dark conditions, so the grain levels are going to be high on both. It's difficult to pick a winner here as both photos aren't really that nice. The iPhone should have the advantage with a wider aperture of f1.8 and optical image stabilization on board, but the differences seem rather minimal. The iPhone does do a little better on exposure than the Pixel, and the Amazon logo seems a little clearer here, so that's a small win for the iPhone. Despite the iPhone having a little more of a haze to it, I prefer the photo here too. The Pixel's produced a warmer photo for sure, but the iPhone takes it on the details. The welcome sign being a good example of how it's managed to retain the edges better. Both have a nasty amount of noise and have overexposed the lights in the windows, but for me this is another little win for the iPhone. To wrap up, I think I prefer the photos from the Pixel in general. Those bumped up colours in the landscape shots look really nice, and I think it does a better job with exposure overall. But let's face it, both phones are excellent mobile shooters, and you won't be left wanting with either one of them. Anyway, that rounds us off for this comparison. Let me know which was your favourite in the comments below, and if you enjoy these videos be sure to pop a like and stay tuned for more. I will see you all in the next one.